Although this training process includes details that point to this distinction, it does not directly highlight it. This distinction lies between loyalty and obedience. The training process cultivates both producing an employee who adheres to institutional requirements and remains loyal to the institutional mission, and in the normal course of an intelligence professional's career, the distinction between these two does not become apparent because obedience and loyalty point in the same direction. You do what the institution wants. You believe in the organization's purpose. These two things are one and the same, and this sameness is the condition that ensures the work proceeds smoothly at a level beneath professional terminology. The friction begins when the compliance and the loyalty diverge. When what the institution requires and what the institution is produce different answers to the same operational question, when you can comply with the requirement or you can serve the mission, but the specific configuration of the problem means you cannot do both simultaneously. Brussels in 1995 was the first posting where I encountered this configuration. Not in a dramatic form. I want to be precise about this from the beginning, because the dramatic version of this story is not the accurate version. The dramatic version involves a decisive moment, a clear choice between institutional compliance and institutional mission, a specific action taken in defiance of or in service of one against the other. That is not what Brussels produced. What Brussels produced was something harder to describe and more persistent in its weight, the sustained awareness across 14 months of operational work that the compliance and the loyalty were no longer pointing in exactly the same direction, and that the gap between them, which was small and specific, and not resolvable through any of the formation's available tools, was mine to carry without institutional acknowledgement that it existed. The institution does not acknowledge the gap. This is not malice. It is structural. The institution is built to produce compliance and loyalty simultaneously, and to treat them as the same thing, because in the normal operation of the institution, they are the same thing. The institutional vocabulary does not contain a word for the space between them. The institutional framework does not have a procedure for the officer who is fully compliant and partially loyal, and is carrying the specific weight of the partial loyalty in the register below the professional vocabulary, without this being visible in any operational output. The operational output in Brussels was sound. This is the most important thing to say at the beginning of this account, because the weight I am describing is not the weight of someone who failed. I did not fail in Brussels. The assessments were accurate. The compliance was complete. The mission was served within the constraints the institutional configuration produced. By every formal standard, the Brussels posting was a successful posting. The weight is the weight of success within a constraint that the institution does not acknowledge. The weight of carrying the gap between what the institution requires and what the institution is for, without the institution providing either the vocabulary to describe the carrying or the acknowledgement that the carrying is occurring. This is what episode 10 is about. The Grand Place in Brussels in November of 1995 is a specific environment that the formation's calibration tools process as a high information space. The medieval guild halls on 3 sides, the Hôtel de Ville on the 4th, the cobblestones. The specific acoustic quality of an enclosed medieval square where sound reflects from 4 directions simultaneously and produces a layered echo that is distinct from any other urban acoustic environment I had registered across the feed. Operational career. I registered all of this on the first morning of the Brussels posting at 0830 hours. Standing at the center of the Grand Place with the November cold producing breath vapor that dispersed in approximately 1.4 seconds in the specific atmospheric condition of Belgian November colder than London, wetter than Budapest, with a quality of cold that is the cold of a city built on a low flat geography where the wind has no obstacle before it reaches you. I registered the cold, the vapor dispersal, the acoustic layering, the cobblestones, Belgian bluestone, the specific gray-blue color of a stone that has been quarried and laid in this city since the 13th century. The 4100 Kelvin quality of the November morning light, which is not fluorescent but has the same color temperature as fluorescent, because November morning light at this latitude produces that specific gray-white that the formation has learned to calibrate against fluorescent as a common reference point. I registered all of this and filed it, plus the formation's first requirement in any new environment: map the water. Brussels has the Seine River, which was largely buried underground in the 19th century as the city modernized, which means the water in Brussels is present but not visible present in the underground channels that the city's drainage and canal infrastructure occupies, present in the wet air that comes off the North Sea plain, present in the specific moisture quality of the cobblestones after rain. I registered the Seine's absence as presence. The water is there. It moves. You cannot see it move. The filing produced Brussels. Seine, underground. Presence without visibility. Current, unknown. This was also, I noted at 0835 hours, at the center of the Grand Place, an accurate description of the posting's primary operational challenge. The Brussels posting was explicitly tied to NATO's post-Cold War restructuring. The institution, the DIA, within the broader American intelligence community, had identified the specific problem of the post-Cold War European security architecture as a priority operational environment, which meant that Brussels in 1995 was a place where multiple institutional frameworks were simultaneously in the process of redefining their mandates, their relationships to each other, and their operational vocabularies. NATO was expanding its membership consideration eastward. The EU was consolidating its institutional framework after Maastricht. The Western European Union was conducting its own assessment of its relevance in the new security architecture, and the specific national intelligence services of the allied nations were each individually recalibrating their relationships to these multilateral frameworks. Into this environment, the DIA had placed an operational capability, ME, under a cover that was thinner than Budapest but more complex in its institutional embedding, with a mandate that the operational briefing described in the formal language of intelligence tasking, and that I will describe here in the PANAS's language of what the mandate actually required. The mandate was: assess the gap between what the Allied intelligence services say they share with American intelligence and what they actually share. Determine the specific categories of information that the Allied services hold in reserve from the shared frameworks. Produce a probability assessment of the motivations for the specific reservations, institutional, political, operational, and identify the individuals within the Allied services whose personal assessment of the appropriate sharing threshold differs from their institutional position. This is a standard intelligence mandate in an Allied environment. It is the kind of work that Allied intelligence services conduct on each other continuously, with full institutional awareness on all sides that the work is being conducted, and with a specific professional courtesy that Allied intelligence relationships are maintained through even when the work produces findings that the Allied relationships might prefer were not found. It is the operational normal of the environment. What made Brussels different, what produced the compliance loyalty gap that this episode is about, was a specific configuration in the mandate's implementation that I will describe as precisely as I can, without disclosing the specific institutional details that are not mine to disclose. The configuration was this. The mandate required me to assess the sharing behavior of a specific Allied service. In the course of developing the assessment, I encountered evidence that the sharing behavior I was assessing was not a reservation from American intelligence, which is what the mandate assumed, but a reservation from a specific American institutional actor whose access to the shared framework was itself the reason the Allied service was reserving the information in question. The Allied service was not withholding from American intelligence. It was withholding from a specific person within American intelligence whose access to the shared framework it did not trust. The evidence for this was indirect but sufficient for a probability assessment. I ran the assessment. The result was a finding that the mandate had not anticipated and that the institutional framework that produced the mandate had no clean procedure for. I had found not what the mandate was looking for, but what the mandate's premise had been wrong about. At 2,200 hours in the Brussels operational accommodation, 38 square meters, a floor below the standard 42, the Belgian accommodation slightly smaller than the Central European standard, with the Seine moving invisibly beneath the city, and the November rain on the window, and the 4,100 Kelvin desk lamp at the correct color. Temperature, I sat with the assessment result and the compliance loyalty gap for the first time as a concrete problem rather than a theoretical distinction. The compliance option was clear. File the assessment in the form the mandate specified. Report what I had found as an anomaly in the Allied sharing behavior, without specifying the probable cause, because the probable cause implicated an American institutional actor, and the reporting channel for findings that implicate American institutional actors runs through different procedures than the reporting channel for Allied behavior assessments. Complying fully with the mandate's reporting requirements was possible without the findings' full implication being visible in the report. The report would be accurate in what it said. It would be incomplete in what it omitted. The loyalty option was also clear. File the complete assessment, including the probable cause finding, through the correct channel, which meant flagging it as a finding that implicated American institutional access rather than Allied behavior, which meant a different audience, a different review process, and a specific institutional friction that findings of this category produce when they arrive in an environment that was expecting a different kind of finding. The gap was compliance with the mandate as specified produced an incomplete report. Complete loyalty to the mission, which was accurate intelligence, not the specific intelligence the mandate had anticipated, required a procedure that the mandate's reporting chain was not configured for. I drank the coffee. The extraction was correct. 90 degrees Celsius. The Brussels machine required a 2-degree adjustment to the grind, which I had made on the second morning of the posting and which had produced correct extraction since. The rain continued on the window. The Seine moved underground. The 4,100 Kelvin light held the room in the institutional white that does not change between cities. The assessment was real. The gap was real. The filing would have to be real. I filed the complete assessment through the correct channel. This is not described here as an act of heroism. It was the operationally correct decision, and it was the decision the probability assessment supported, and it was the decision I would make again in the same configuration. But it was not the decision the mandate's compliance structure anticipated, and it produced the specific institutional friction that such decisions produce, and the friction was mine to carry alongside the carrying structure that the posting added it to. The question that belongs in the middle of this episode, placed here, because the structure of these accounts places questions where they produce the most sustained pressure, is this: when the institution you serve and the mission you serve through that institution produce different answers to the same question, and you choose the mission, what have you done to the institution? I have been asking this question since 2,200 hours in a 38 square meter Brussels apartment in November of 1995. I have not produced a clean answer. The probability assessment that I have conducted across the 29 years of subsequent experience that separates the question from this account produces the following finding, which I will share as a current state of assessment rather than a conclusion. Choosing the mission over the compliance does not betray the institution. The institution's purpose is the mission. When compliance and mission diverge, choosing the mission is choosing what the institution is actually for over what the institution's specific procedural configuration in a specific moment requires. This is not disloyalty. It is the specific form of loyalty that the institution cannot acknowledge because the institutional vocabulary does not contain the distinction between compliance and loyalty. The institution treats them as synonyms, and the officer who acts on the distinction is acting in a space the institution does not have language for. But acting in a space the institution does not have language for means acting without institutional cover. It means the weight of the decision is entirely yours. The institution does not share the weight because the institution does not acknowledge the gap that produced it. The carrying is yours, and the institutional record does not reflect it, and the institutional recognition does not arrive, and the weight does not reduce. This is not a complaint. I am describing a structural feature of the work, not a grievance. The institution is built correctly for what it is built for. The gap between compliance and loyalty is a feature of the intelligence professional's condition, not a failure of the institutional design. The institution cannot be built to contain every configuration of operational reality. Some configurations will always exceed the institutional vocabulary. The officer who encounters those configurations carries what the institution cannot carry on their behalf. This is the work. The formation builds you for it without naming it. The carrying structure holds it without acknowledging it. And the weight does not reduce. Let me tell you about Catherine Walsh. Catherine Walsh was a DIA analyst based in Washington in 1995, 31 years old, whose work on European security architecture assessment I had encountered through the shared analytical framework that connected the Brussels operational environment to the institutional analytical capacity. She was good. This is not a characterization I offer frequently or without the specific evidence the formation's assessment methodology requires. Walsh was good in the specific sense that the formation recognizes as good. Her analytical conclusions were accurate before the operational data that confirmed them was available, which is the specific test that separates pattern recognition from correlation. She was seeing the shape of the thing before the thing had fully arrived. I noted this across 3 separate analytical products in the autumn of 1995. Filed it. The notation was operational. She was an analytical resource whose assessment capacity was relevant to the Brussels mandate's requirements. But the notation also went into the 3rd file. The file that had been opened in Budapest in December of 1993, when the pattern of unusual environmental reading capacity in people without the formation's specific training had been given a file of its own. 11 words at opening. The Budapest architect had added to it. Walsh was adding to it now. The pattern was this. Across the people whose files contributed to the 3rd file, Al-Rashid, the architect, Walsh, and 2 others whose names I will not use in this account. The common element was not a specific skill or a specific institutional position or a specific training background. The common element was a specific relationship to information and pattern. Each of these individuals demonstrated the capacity to arrive at accurate assessments of complex, ambiguous situations before the information that would formally support those assessments was available. They were pre-formal pattern recognizers. They reached the right answer before the evidence had organized itself into the answer. Walsh did this with European security architecture. The architect had done it with the post-communist transition. Al-Rashid had done it with the geopolitical transition of the late Cold War. I registered this pattern in November of 1995 and added to the 3rd file. The file was now 63 words, still thin, but growing. And the pattern it described was beginning to have a shape. Brussels, in December of 1995, had a specific quality of light that was distinct from the November light I had registered on the first morning. The November light had the flat gray quality of the season, the low sun at this latitude in November, producing the institutional gray-white that I had calibrated against fluorescent at 4,100 Kelvin. The December light was different, not in color temperature, but in duration. In Brussels in December, the functional daylight is approximately 8 hours long, which is significantly shorter than the functional daylight of any previous operational posting, except Bonn, in December 1989. The 8-hour window produced a specific quality of operational rhythm, the morning operational work beginning in darkness, the evening operational work continuing in darkness, the midday window of gray winter light, the only natural light of the day. I walked the Grand Place at 1,215 hours in December to take the midday light. Not operationally required, the Grand Place was not part of the Brussels posting's operational geography in any direct sense. But the formation had given me the habit of marking the light in each environment, and the midday light in Brussels in December had a quality worth marking. The gray-white winter light on the guild halls, the Hôtel de Ville, the blue stone cobblestones, the specific combination of the medieval stone and the December light and the cold from the North Sea plain that arrived without obstacle across the flat Belgian geography. It was a high-information environment at an unusual moment of the day, and the formation registered it. I stood in the center of the Grand Place for 7 minutes at 1,215 hours. The cobblestones were cold underfoot. The breath vapor dispersed in 1.3 seconds, slightly faster than the November measurement. The December air drier and slightly colder. The acoustic layering of the enclosed square was present. My own footsteps on the cobblestones producing echoes from all 4 walls simultaneously. The echo arriving fractionally delayed from the more distant guild halls and arriving almost simultaneously from the nearer ones. The Hôtel de Ville's larger mass-producing a slightly different echo quality from the guild halls on the other 3 sides. I registered all of this. The compliance question was still open. The complete assessment had been filed. The institutional response was in the process that institutional responses to unusual filings follow slow, procedurally careful, not resolved within the timeline of the operational posting. I was carrying the compliance loyalty gap and its weight, while the institutional process moved through its stages, in the specific way that the formation had built the carrying structure to hold things that the institution is processing more slowly than the person who generated them. The cobblestones were 4,100 Kelvin in the December light. The Seine moved underground. The water was there. I could not see it. I knew its direction. The Brussels posting concluded in February of 1996. The institutional process related to the complete assessment had not concluded. It would not conclude until the following autumn, and its conclusion was not dramatic in the way that the original finding had suggested it might be. It was institutional. It produced the specific category of institutional result that unusual filings tend to produce: acknowledgement that the finding was accurate, adjustment to the relevant procedures, no formal recognition of the decision to file completely rather than partially, and the addition of a notation to the operational record that was accurate in its description and incomplete in its acknowledgement of what the accurate description had cost. The weight was not in the record. The weight was in the carrying structure. Alongside Victor Hale and the contact and the Budapest calibration arrow and everything the previous postings had placed on the structure, Brussels added the compliance loyalty weight. The weight of a decision that was correct and unacknowledged, and mine alone to carry. Catherine Walsh's name was in the 3rd file. 63 words, growing. The pattern was becoming legible. I did not know in February of 1996 what the pattern would require in 2003. The file was patient. I was patient. The formation had built both. Marcus Webb was still in the institutional hierarchy. The institutional rotation that would eventually produce his forced conclusion of my career was 14 years ahead, in February of 1996. I had not yet assessed the specific configuration that would make that conclusion the one the institution would choose. But the formation had built someone whose assessments tend to arrive before the evidence has formally organized itself into the assessment, and the assessment of Webb's trajectory had been running since the spring silence of 1,988 inches of Vienna. The assessment was thin. It was growing. I registered it in Brussels in February of 1996, alongside everything else. The Grand Place in February is a different environment from the Grand Place in November and December. The February cold is the deep cold. The cold after January has stripped everything that November still left in the air. The guild halls in February light, what little February light there is, have a quality of endurance that the autumn does not yet require them to demonstrate. They have been standing in this configuration since the rebuilding after the French bombardment of 1695. They will be standing when everything I have described in this account has been absorbed into the institutional record, and the institutional record has been sealed, and the people whose names appear in these files have lived out the consequences of the operational decisions I describe, and the files that bear their names have been reclassified, and the reclassification has been reviewed, and the review has produced whatever the institutional process produces. The guild halls do not know this. They hold their position. The Seine moves beneath them. The water is there. The current is unknown. The carrying structure left Brussels heavier than it arrived. Not destroyed, constituted differently. The compliance loyalty gap was now part of the architecture, integrated into the load-bearing structure in the way that a weight that has been held long enough eventually integrates. It was not comfortable. It was not resolved. The institutional process had produced its institutional result, and the institutional result was correct within the institutional framework. And the institutional framework did not contain the weight that the correct institutional result did not acknowledge. The weight is mine. It has always been mine. This is not a complaint. Quote, "This is the specific condition of the work when the work is done correctly in configurations that the institutional framework cannot fully contain. The institution is built for the normal. The officer is built for what exceeds the normal. The exceeding is where the weight accumulates. The weight is what the carrying structure is for." Catherine Walsh would appear again in this account. The third file would grow. The compliance loyalty gap would appear again in different configurations, in different postings. Each configuration slightly different from the Brussels configuration, but recognizably the same category of weight. And the carrying structure would hold it, as it has held everything since Pittsburgh in 1961, when a person was first being built for the specific work of holding what the institution cannot hold on its behalf. The gray operative. Every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. The weight this episode describes is present in every subsequent episode. It is carried in the structure. It is not visible in the institutional record. It is load-bearing. And if this episode has pressed into you the specific question of what you owe to the system you operate within and what you owe to what the system is for, when the two things point in different directions, then the episode has done what these accounts intend, not to answer the question, to press it into you with the weight it carries. To make the question part of the structure you are building by listening to this account in sequence. The order is the architecture. The architecture is the account. The carrying continues. The gray operative. Every week, without exception. There is something about the Grand Place that I want to return to, because it belongs in this account in a way that I did not fully address in the earlier sections. And the returning is itself a form of the carrying that this episode is about. The Grand Place was rebuilt after Louis XIV's artillery destroyed the original medieval structures in 1695. The bombardment lasted 2 days. The guild halls that existed before 1695 are not the guild halls that exist now. The present guild halls were built in the years immediately following the bombardment, in the specific period of reconstruction that a city undertakes when it has been destroyed. and chooses to rebuild rather than abandon. The rebuilding was accomplished in approximately 4 years. The guild halls that stood in November and December of 1995, when I was walking the Grand Place, were therefore not medieval buildings in the sense of structures that had survived from the medieval period. They were 17th century buildings built in the style and on the foundations of what the bombardment had destroyed. They were copies of the originals, built by the people who had lost the originals in the specific period of grief and determination that follows destruction. I registered this in December of 1995, standing at the center of the Grand Place in the midday gray-white light. And it produced a thought that I did not file in any operational document, but that I am including in this account because it belongs here. The thought was this: the institution I was serving in Brussels in 1995 was also a rebuilt structure, not a medieval original. A reconstruction built in the specific period following a destruction, the destruction being the Second World War, the reconstruction being the post-war institutional architecture of the American intelligence community, the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA, the DIA, all of it built in the years immediately following the bombardment of the Old World by the specific artillery of the previous century's specific catastrophe. The institutional framework I was complying with and being loyal to was a 17th century guild hall built by people who had lost something to honor what had been lost, in a form that reproduced the original's function while being structurally something new. This does not undermine the institution. The Grand Place guild halls are real buildings that do real institutional work. They house businesses, receive tourists, define the urban center of a European capital. Their status as reconstructions does not make them less functional. It makes them what they are: the best available reproduction of something that was lost, built by people who understood what had been lost and chose to build rather than abandon. The intelligence institutional architecture is the same. The best available reproduction of something that the previous century's catastrophe demonstrated was necessary, but did not survive the catastrophe intact, built by people who understood what had been lost and chose to build rather than abandon, serving the function it was built to serve with the specific limitations of a structure that was built after a destruction rather than grown over centuries. The gap between compliance and loyalty is one of those limitations. The original medieval buildings, the intelligence structures that existed before the catastrophe, whatever form they took, may have had better mechanisms for handling the gap, or they may not. The record does not survive completely enough to know. What I know is that the reconstruction did not include a mechanism for the gap, and that the absence of the mechanism is not a design flaw, but a feature of reconstruction. You reproduce what you remember, and what you remember may not include everything that the original contained. I stood at the center of the Grand Place for 7 minutes in December 1995 and registered the buildings and their age and their status as reconstructions and the thought they produced, received, registered, filed, not in any operational document, in the register below the professional vocabulary, where the thoughts that are not operationally relevant but are structurally significant live alongside everything else the carrying structure holds. The Seine River's burial is worth more attention than I have given it, because it is the most accurate available metaphor for the specific condition that the Brussels posting illuminated. The Seine was buried in the 1860s and 1870s during the massive urban renovation that the second Burgmeester of Brussels, Jules Anspach, undertook in conscious imitation of Haussmann's renovation of Paris. The renovation was motivated by cholera. The Seine had become a conduit for the disease that the medieval city's waste had produced, and the solution the 19th century offered was burial. The river was channeled underground, covered over, and the surface above it was redesigned as the grand boulevards that Brussels still has. The river continues to flow. It has always continued to flow. The burial did not eliminate the flow. It made the flow invisible, the operational relationship to information that the Brussels Mandate had discovered the Allied service withholding from a specific American institutional actor rather than from American intelligence, was also a buried river. It was flowing. It had always been flowing. The Mandate had assumed the surface geography and found nothing. The Mandate had not been equipped to detect the underground flow. I had detected it not because the Mandate gave me the tools to detect it, but because the formation had built a specific capacity for registering what is present but not visible. The formation's calibration includes the hidden current, the movement that the surface does not show, the water that is there even when you cannot see it move. This is, I think, the most accurate description of what the formation is building across the years of its assembly, not the capacity to see what is visible. Anyone can see what is visible. The formation is building the capacity to register the presence of what is not visible. To know the direction of the current from the surface effects that the current produces without being able to see the current directly. To map the water when the water is underground. The Seine runs under Brussels at approximately 0.8 meters per second slower than the Thames, significantly slower than the Rhine or the Danube in the underground channels that the 19th century built for it. The flow rate is estimated rather than directly measured because the channels are not routinely accessible for measurement. The estimate is derived from the surface effects, the drainage patterns, the moisture content of the soil, the specific behavior of the city's underground infrastructure in relation to rainfall. The formation does this with rivers. The formation does this with people. The formation does this with institutions. The Brussels finding was a Seine detection. I had registered the presence of a current that the surface of the Mandate's geography did not show. The current was real. The detection was accurate. The filing of the detection was correct. And the weight of filing what the Mandate had not anticipated in the register that the Mandate's compliance structure had not been built to contain was the specific Seine weight that Brussels placed on the carrying structure. One more thing. It belongs here because it belongs to the specific carrying that this episode requires, and because I have been circling it across the entire account without stating it directly, and the stating is what this section of the account is for. The person within the American institutional framework from whom the Allied service was withholding, the person whose access to the shared framework had produced Allied services reservation, was someone I knew, not well, not in the sense of a professional relationship with significant history, but known. A name in the institutional network. A face in a corridor in Washington in 1993, at the margins of a briefing that I had attended for a different purpose. A person whose operational methodology I had registered and assessed as producing results that the methodology's proponents valued and that I assessed as correct in their conclusions but imprecise in their methods, which is a category of operational imprecision that tends to produce the specific kind of institutional friction that Allied services respond to by withholding. I did not name this person in the complete assessment. The finding described the category of actor and the specific behavioral indicators without identifying the individual, because the identification of an individual within the American institutional framework from an operational field assessment is a finding that requires a different level of evidentiary support than I had, and the probability assessment supported the category finding but not the individual identification. The finding was as complete as the evidence supported. The weight of not naming the person, of knowing, with a probability that fell short of identification level certainty, who the actor was, and filing the category finding without the individual finding, is a different weight from the compliance loyalty weight. It is the weight of the formation's own epistemic standard applied to a finding that the formation's epistemic standard determined was not yet at the level that identification requires. The weight of being right at the category level and uncertain at the individual level, and choosing to file at the level of certainty rather than the level of probability, this is the right choice. The formation's epistemic standard exists for this reason. An individual identification that falls short of the evidentiary standard is more damaging than a category finding that awaits confirmation. I made the right choice. I would make it again. The weight is the weight of a right choice, made with incomplete information, in the knowledge that the incompleteness might have consequences that complete information would have prevented. The weight of what you cannot know and have to act on anyway. The weight of the formation's epistemic standard applied honestly to the limit of what the formation's calibration can see. The Sene moves underground at 0.8 meters per second. The current is estimated. The estimation is the best available reading of the available surface evidence. The estimation is filed as estimation, not as measurement. The filing is complete. The weight is real. The gray operative. Every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. And if you have been here across 10 episodes from Pittsburgh in 1961 through West Point and the desert and Berlin and Vienna and Bonn and London and Budapest and now Brussels, then you understand that the account is not building toward a conclusion. It is building toward the weight, the accumulated weight of 10 episodes of carrying what the institution cannot carry, what the formation names without addressing, what the carrying structure holds without acknowledging. The weight is what remains when the operational details are sealed. The weight is the account, the gray operative, every week, without exception.